Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to begin by thanking a number of my colleagues who have contributed so much to bringing us to this point on Senate Resolution 54. I have been very pleased and honored to work with them in co-sponsoring these measures in the past, most recently in March and now today, to end all United States involvement in the Saudi-led war in Yemen that is killing innocent civilians and murdering children and committing, arguably, war crimes. The United States should have no complicity in these actions that betray our values and our national interests. And so this resolution would direct the removal of all United States armed forces from hostilities. There are many to thank: Senators Sanders and Lee, Senator Menendez, and my colleague from Connecticut, Senator Murphy. But I want to thank some people who have been unmentioned during this proceeding. Before Yemen, and before the killing of Khashoggi, that is, before the civil war in Yemen and the Saudi involvement in it, and before the brutal, heinous killing of the American journalist Jamal Khashoggi, there was 9/11. The victims and loved ones of those victims are remembered by me. They are friends. They are heroes. They have fought relentlessly to hold the government of Saudi Arabia accountable for its culpability. Not yet proven in court, but they are seeking to hold the monarchy accountable for its possible involvement. They have been largely absent from the discussion on this floor, but they are the original champions of holding responsible the Saudis for any and all possible involvement in supporting the 9/11 attack on our nation. Make no mistake, their loved ones were victims, but it was an attack on our nation, on the Twin Towers, on our Defense Department, on a plane that was forced to crash in Pennsylvania. I'm pleased that the United States Senate is pursuing justice for Jamal Khashoggi. He's a journalist, an opinion writer for an American newspaper with 2 young children who are United States citizens. The United States has a moral obligation to end support for a government that engages in this kind of heinous, murderous action. And there is intelligence that points directly to the highest levels of the Saudi monarchy, namely to the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. And the United States ought to end its support for the humanitarian crisis caused by the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Make no mistake, it was and is a Saudi-led attack, and the kingdom is responsible for it. But this monarchy was doing bad things and engaged in bad behavior well before the Yemen civil war and Khashoggi's tragic death. The Saudis have a long record of violating human rights and international norms. They have funded extremism that led to the rise of terrorism. They may well have provided financial support, and even training for the Saudis who went to the United States and thereafter enabled and led and participated in the attack on this nation. We should never forget the survivors and the loved ones of 9/11. We should never overlook the Saudi role in that horrific attack. We should never relent in supporting those 9/11 families. And fortunately, we have made progress in holding Saudi Arabia accountable for its culpability in 9/11. In 2016, this Congress unanimously passed the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, JASTA, to allow terrorist victims their day in court, their fair opportunity to hold accountable state sponsors of terrorism, including the Saudi Arabian government. And this September, the Senate unanimously passed my resolution to release all classified documents related to the 9/11 attack. These documents are absolutely essential to giving those families their day in court because they are the evidence that is needed to establish the link. The United States has intelligence dating from those days, now seemingly long ago, that inculpates the Saudis. We must support the continued investigation into 9/11 by our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and we must support those 9/11 families to ensure that the facts are made public and the necessary individuals, entities, and governments be held accountable. The families of victims who perished on that horrific day deserve answers about those events and circumstances surrounding the terrorist attack. We know that their pain and grief are very much with them. We should respect their loss and honor it with action. We should recognize those heroes like Brett Eagleson of Connecticut and the families of Connecticut and New York and New Jersey and all around the country. And so many are from our area of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, who continue to demand justice and have done so year after year after year, well before this resolution came before us. And so I say to my colleagues today, we need to keep our resolve alive and well to never forget, never yield to hopelessness, never allow our support for these 9/11 families to diminish, never cease our quest for justice in the name of Brett Eagleson's dad and his family and every family who still suffers the pain and grief from 9/11. Given the role of the Saudi government in perpetrating the 9/11 attacks, the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and the Saudi-inflicted humanitarian crisis, this reevaluation of the United States' relationship with Saudi Arabia is long overdue. The Saudi-led war has consisted of an aggressive campaign, as brutal as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, indiscriminately killing civilians and Houthis alike. Day after day after day, the humanitarian crisis of famine, cholera, other medical afflictions, and simple trauma to those children trying to grow up in the midst of exploding bombs continues to get worse. The United Nations warns that 14 million Yemenis could face starvation. 14 million. 14 million innocent people facing starvation. Diplomatic efforts in coordination with the United Nations and European allies are vital to establish a peace framework and ensure civilian access to humanitarian aid. And in the absence of meaningful action from the United States, the humanitarian crisis in Yemen will only worsen. Regional instability will be exacerbated. American standing in the global community will be further undercut and enduringly diminished. In March of this year, I led a letter to the Department of Defense with my colleague, Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, along with many of our colleagues on the Senate Armed Services Committee, stating our concern regarding U.S. support for Saudi military operations against the Houthis in Yemen and asking about the DOD's involvement, apparently without appropriate notification of Congress in its agreements to provide refueling support to the Saudis and the Saudi coalition partners. We were concerned that the DOD had not appropriately documented reimbursements for aerial refueling support provided by the United States. 8 months later, just days ago, the Department of Defense responded to our letter and admitted that it has failed to appropriately notify Congress of its support agreements. It has failed to adequately charge Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for fuel and refueling assistance. That admission, 8 months after our inquiry, is a damning indictment. These errors in accounting mean that the United States was directly funding the Saudi war in Yemen. It has been doing it since March of 2015. In November, the administration announced an end to United States aerial refueling support for Saudi military operations in Yemen, but we still must determine whether the Department of Defense was incompetent or disingenuous or both in failing to charge the Saudis and Emiratis for previous refueling assistance. We need accountability, a full explanation from the Department of Defense. The department will be seeking reimbursement for its refueling support, but I will continue to demand and conduct oversight to get to the bottom of this apparent negligence. I've made the DOD aware of my concerns, and I will evaluate whether an Inspector General investigation is necessary to determine the extent to which United States taxpayer funds, potentially millions and tens of millions of dollars, were used to fund the Saudi war, and used to fund it without the legally required acknowledgement and approval from the Congress of the United States. Very simply, the United States should not be funding this war. We should not be supporting this war. We should not be providing intelligence or logistics support. We should not be complicit in the indiscriminate targeting of civilians in Yemen, the murder of children, the famine and humanitarian crisis that are ongoing right now. And that's why today we should pass this resolution. It is all the more important today as well that the Senate take a stand, given the Trump family ties to the Saudis and the president's habit of undermining the intelligence community. In the absence of leadership from the president, Congress must reassert its constitutional responsibility to authorize United States military support. We must take action to uphold the Constitution as well as American values and interests. Intelligence assessments indicate with high certainty that members of the Saudi royal family, including the Crown Prince, MSB, ordered and orchestrated the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But both President Trump and his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, have undermined these findings and tried to stifle the intelligence community conclusions. They have undermined not only these conclusions, but more broadly, the intelligence community itself. President Trump has debased and dishonored brave intelligence professionals by demeaning their fact-based conclusion as, quote, feelings, end quote. President Trump has falsely claimed, quote, we may never know all the facts surrounding the murder of Mr. Jamal Khashoggi, end quote. And his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, unfortunately, have further demeaned those findings by saying there is no direct evidence or there is no smoking gun. The fact is that there is powerful and compelling evidence. We know from the public statements of my colleagues coming from briefings by the intelligence community. And we recently learned that the White House Middle East advisor, I should put advisor in quotes, Jared Kushner, offered advice to his close friend, Mohammed bin Salman, about how to, quote, weather the storm, end quote, during warranted backlash against Saudi Arabia after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Rather than ensuring accountability, Jared Kushner is inexplicably offering support. And there is stunning evidence that the Saudi government lobbyists reserved blocks of room at the Trump Hotel in Washington, paying for an estimated 500 nights in a luxury hotel, just 3 months after President Trump was elected, bringing veterans to Washington to lobby against JASTA, that bill I mentioned earlier, that bill that enables the 9/11 victims to have their day in court, that bill that upholds American interests and American values and American people. The effort of the Saudi government to bring those veterans to Washington and fund their stays in the Trump Hotel was a despicable irony and insult to America. But it yielded the Trump Organization $270,000 and millions of dollars by the president's own acknowledgement, indeed his boasting, go to the Trump Organization from condos, apartments, offices, rented or bought in New York and Chicago and Washington, D.C., to say nothing of deals that may be contemplated by the Trump Organization now or after Donald Trump leaves office. These kinds of payments and benefits directly implicate the Emoluments Clause of the United States Constitution. They're part of the reason that I have enlisted almost 200 of my colleagues in the United States Congress in a lawsuit called Trump, Blumenthal versus Trump. And I believe that this lawsuit, which claims that the president is violating the chief anti-corruption provision of the United States Constitution, will shed even more light on those payments and benefits from Saudi Arabia and other countries around the world. These friendships and conflicts of interest demonstrate the very flawed and likely corrupt basis for the Trump administration's foreign policy in Saudi Arabia. American credibility is at stake. We must end all United States involvement in the Saudi war. We must sanction the top levels of the Saudi monarchy under relevant statutes like the Global Magnitsky Act. We must ensure that the president removes U.S. forces from any hostilities against the Yemeni people. There are countless reasons to vote for this resolution. I call on my colleagues to support it and to make sure that United States support for this unacceptable conflict in Saudi, the aggression and attacks by Saudi Arabia on innocent civilians, is ended now. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my intern, Adam Berry, be granted privileges of the floor for the balance of the day.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Under our Constitution, we have Article 1, which addresses the powers of Congress, and Article 2, the powers of the presidency. Our founders were so concerned that the president would take us into war without justification that they made sure to explicitly place the power to go to war with Congress, with the House and the Senate. But here we are debating the issue of how the president took us into war in Yemen as a facilitator of Saudi Arabia, providing intelligence, providing advice, refueling planes, providing armaments. It is time for us to take a powerful and clear stand and change this and end this. Well, here's what's been going on. For multiple years now, Saudi Arabia has been bombing the civilian infrastructure of Yemen, indiscriminately slaughtering civilians, destroying schools and hospitals and neighborhoods and water systems. And what's the result of destroying the water systems? The largest outbreak of cholera in the history of humankind. We now have well over 100 children under the age of 5 a day dying of hunger and starvation. We're told by the experts that 8 to 14 million people are at risk of starvation. But many are already starving, and not just children under 5, the whole spectrum of society. We have been directly involved in ways that, in my mind, violate the War Powers Act by directly facilitating the movement of armaments and assisting Saudi Arabia in this assault, an assault that must end, and we have to send a strong message. And we can do that through this vote we're facing ahead of us. That's one piece of the conversation regarding Saudi Arabia. But the other piece is that the Saudi government has assassinated an American resident who is also an American newspaper columnist. And what do we have as a response? We have the weakest possible response from our president, President Trump. President Trump saying, we don't know what happened. The Saudi crown prince may have been involved, he might not have been involved, who will ever know? We need a strong watchdog for American values. We need the president to stand up to Saudi Arabia. We don't need to hear that we are going to be weak in the face of an assassination of an American resident because they happen to buy armaments from the United States. And yet that's what we're hearing from President Trump. Weakness. Selling out American values because they buy some American products. What more trouble can we invite around the world if we don't stand up for human rights, and we don't stand up for our residents, and we don't stand up for our journalists, all tied in together here? So let's be forceful in how we vote on this resolution. Let's send a strong message. This challenge of the president ignoring the Article 1 powers in our Constitution in which the power to be involved in war is vested in this body, Congress, is not the only problem we have. We also have core corruption of our Constitution in the form of gerrymandering and voter suppression and dark money, all of which erode the fundamental vision, the vision in our Constitution of a we the people government, one that serves, as President Lincoln so eloquently said, to operate of the people, by the people, for the people. But instead, we have government operating of, by, and for the powerful in this country, the 1% in this country. It's certainly what we saw in 2017 with a tax bill that took $1.5 trillion, or call it $2 trillion if you include the interest on the $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion out of our federal treasury and gave it to the very richest Americans. Boy, well, that's not a we the people action. We didn't invest in health care. We didn't invest in education. We need apprenticeship programs. We need career technical education. We need better public schools. We need affordable college, but we didn't invest in education. We didn't make our health care system more affordable. We didn't take on the drug companies. We didn't proceed to invest in the challenge of unaffordable housing. We didn't invest in infrastructure and create living wage jobs. In other words, the four foundations of a thriving family: healthcare, housing, education, living wage jobs. We ignored all that and had government for the powerful, giving $1.5 trillion or $2 trillion, if we include the interest, to the richest Americans. Government by and for the powerful. Well, voter suppression is a key strategy in this. And what did President Reagan have to say about that? President Reagan said, "For this nation to remain true to its principles, we cannot allow any American's vote to be denied, diluted, or defiled." Now, there's a statement by a man who understood that voting is the foundation of our democratic republic, a core right of Americans. And he believed we needed to stand up and make sure that that core value remains fully intact. But so often in our nation, we've seen those who wish to wield power for the powerful proceed to deny or dilute or defile the power to vote, particularly poor communities, particularly communities of color. We've seen everything. We've seen poll taxes. We've seen literacy tests. We've seen post-Civil War good character tests. We've seen the use of felony charges to make it impossible for African Americans to vote in the South. We've seen voter intimidation, and we've seen it sometimes through racist, dog whistling, political postcards. We have a long history of these types of actions to deny, to dilute, and defile the power to vote. And I'd like to say that there's something of our past, that we solved this with the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But that act was struck down by the Supreme Court. And we're seeing all kinds of forms of voter suppression emerge in 2016 and 2018. In 2018, thousands of Native Americans in North Dakota living on tribal reserves and using their post office boxes for their mail address were kept from casting a ballot because of a law that came into effect in 2018. Said you can't vote without a conventional address. The North Dakota conventional address effort to dilute or deny, obstruct the power to vote. In Georgia, the then Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, who was himself running for governor, attempted to block 53,000 Georgians from voting, 70% of whom were African American voters, because of minor differences in the wording of the way they filled out the registration form. If the name wasn't exactly identical or some other slight variation, he was sitting on those voting registration cards. The identical name gambit from Georgia. In Ohio, a county election board proceeded on the orders of Secretary of State John Husted to purge thousands of Ohioans from the voting rolls. If they're on the voting rolls, you can't vote when the election comes. And again, who was disproportionately affected? African Americans. The Ohio voting roll purge strategy of voter suppression. What did we see in North Carolina? Thanks to a law passed by the Republican state legislature, nearly 20% of North Carolina's early voting locations were closed, forcing voters to travel longer or wait in long election day lines to cast their vote. I'll give you one guess on who was impacted the most. How was this target aimed? Well, what was aimed at African American voters? The long line strategy from North Carolina and from Kansas as well. In Kansas, the county clerk in Dodge City, citing construction, moved the only polling place in a town that's 60% Hispanic from downtown to arena built for rodeo and farm equipment shows outside the city limits. A location that had no sidewalks. The location separated from the rest of the city by train tracks. Make it as difficult as possible for voters to get there, targeted at a Hispanic community. Oh, we saw voting suppression aimed at college students too. In Iowa, the legislature passed a bill to cut 11 days off of early voting this year to make it harder to vote. But it also had a tricky little deal on an ID requirement, which won't now go into effect until next year. But it created a great deal of confusion about this year because it made people think they weren't eligible to vote, because it said that your ID had to have an expiration date on it. And why was this tricky little thing done? Because college IDs often don't have an expiration date on them. Well, total violation of the vision Ronald Reagan laid out, and really the foundation, the vision of our Constitution, the power to vote. And in New Hampshire, a bill was signed into law this past July aimed at suppressing college-age voters as well. It says that students and other part-time residents have to become permanent residents. And how do you become a permanent resident in order to cast a ballot? Well, you have to buy an in-state license. And if you have a car in another state, you have to re-register it in New Hampshire, which means registration fees and fees for license plates, possibly separate state and municipal fees. It's like a poll tax placed on college students. So there we have this 21st century poll tax coming back aimed at college students. Now, why are all these voting suppression strategies aimed at poor communities, aimed at communities of color, African American communities, Hispanic communities? Why are they aimed at college students? They're aimed at these three populations because those three populations vote primarily on the Democratic side of the ballot. It is wrong for any official in this country to simply target voters of the other party to try to prevent them from vote. It's un-American. It goes against the essence of what our Constitution is all about. It is wrong. And yet, since the Voting Rights Act was torn down by the Supreme Court of the United States, we see it time and time again. We don't just see it before the election, we see it during the election day. In Georgia, we saw hours-long lines to vote in minority-majority districts. Well, machines just didn't happen to be working, or they didn't have the extension cords to turn them on. In Arizona, one polling place didn't exist on election day because even though people were told to vote there, it was in a building that was locked up. Voting machines were inside, the doors were locked. The building had been foreclosed on. Didn't bother to move it next door or somewhere close by and enable people to vote. In Texas, we heard about the machines that were changing people's votes from a Democratic candidate to a Republican candidate. And all the while, President Trump was working to cast doubt on the legitimacy of our normal election process, tweeting out that ballots coming in after election night shouldn't be accounted. Well, what was he talking about? What was he talking about down in Florida about ballots that shouldn't be counted? We're talking about the absentee ballots from our soldiers overseas. But because the president was concerned they might change the outcome, he didn't want them counted. If only Ronald Reagan could spend a few minutes with President Trump and remind him of what our nation is all about, what our Constitution is all about, how important voting is, and that it should never be denied or diluted. None of these efforts are unique. We saw these efforts back in 2016 as well. The first election after the Voting Rights Act was torn down by the Supreme Court. That was the Shelby County versus Holder decision. And the court thought this wasn't necessary anymore. Maybe they should ask Congress whether it was necessary. And now that we find out it was necessary, maybe they should reverse their decision. Maybe we need to put a new issue before them. Maybe we need a new Voting Rights Act. Maybe it should apply to every state rather than just the states that were in the 1965 Voting Rights Act bill. You know, in 2016, that first election after the Voting Rights Act was torn down by the Supreme Court, we saw 900 fewer polling places open to voters than in 2014, 2 years earlier. And most of that change was in the states that previously were under the regulation, the oversight of the Voting Rights Act. We saw that Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina. You reduce the number of voting places in poor and communities of color, you create long wait lines, and you deny the vote. Nearly 17,000 Wisconsinites, disproportionately minorities, were kept from the polls because of Wisconsin's voter ID law. The state saw its lowest turnout in 2 decades. Now, this law had nothing to do with security. It had everything to do with voter suppression because it's a known fact that residents in low-income and minority communities are less likely to be able to access the IDs that are required at the polls. This is keenly targeted. In fact, after North Carolina's voter ID law was struck down in 2016, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals decision noted that it targeted African Americans, and I quote, with almost surgical precision. The state resorted that year after it was struck down to eliminating early voting days, severely curtailing the number of polling places, affecting their hours of operation in communities of color. By the way, the lead plaintiff in the case that challenged the voting suppression strategy of the voter ID law passed away this weekend at age 97. Ms. Rosanelle Eaton was once described by President Obama as a beacon of civil rights, and she was a lifelong devotee of and advocate for voting rights. Now that's a patriot. It's because of unsung heroes like her that our nation has come far, and it must continue pushing ourselves forward to ensure justice and equality for all. In a we the people nation, can any of these efforts to suppress the vote be allowed to continue? And the answer is no, not if we want the vision of government of, by, and for the people. How can any of us sit by and allow citizens of this country, citizens like Rosanelle Eaton, to be systematically denied the most fundamental right? So we have to work together, Democrats and Republicans together, to honor, to strengthen the vision of the ability to vote. We need a fierce, a formidable voting rights bill for the 21st century, ensuring in every way possible that every single American can exercise his or her right to vote freely and fairly. We need a voting rights bill that bans the type of shenanigans, the types of deceptive strategies, the type of strategies targeted at poor communities, communities of color, and college students that I've talked about today. But we also need a voting rights bill that requires pre-approval to change voting procedures to make sure that they're not being changed in order to take away the ability to vote, to make it more difficult for some communities than for other communities within a state. We need a voting rights commission with the power to ban new voter suppression practices as they evolve, because surely people will try new strategies who do not believe, from people who do not believe in the vision of our Constitution. From the 15th Amendment of 1870 that recognized African Americans' right to vote, to the 19th Amendment of 1920, 50 years later, which recognized the woman's right to vote, all the way up through the civil rights marches of the 1960s and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, America's story has been of expanding opportunity for every American to have a say in the direction of our government. But we are far from ensuring that today every American has that opportunity, because the strategies of voter suppression are rampant, they are extensive, and they are targeted. Voter suppression and voter intimidation must end, and we need to ensure that every American has the unfettered right to have a voice in their government, that every American has an unfettered right to cast a ballot during the election. President Reagan had it right back in 1981. He supported the expansion of the Voting Rights Act, the expansion. And he said, for this nation to remain true to its principles, we cannot allow any American's vote to be denied, diluted, or defiled. Let's make it so. Thank you, Mr. President.